Asante, thank you so much for joining me on the You're Not Alone podcast today. I'm super excited to have you on. We met for it, we call it coffee, but neither one of us got coffee. You got a smoothie and like some sort of snack, and I got an ice green tea because I had my fill of caffeine for the day. But we met up this week, and we run across each other all the time at the gym, and just have learned about you through other people. So big shout out Ryan, who's also been on the show.
Big shout out to Ryan.
Yeah, big shout out to Ryan. And through that process, learned that you have a story. Of course, we all as human beings have a story, but that you have just a really, really powerful story. And there's a lot of work that you're doing. And I want to give you the opportunity to share that today. And so could you just quickly give an introduction of yourself to my audience?
Yeah. And first of all, Zach, thanks so much for having me on. I really admire what you're doing. But yeah, I'm Asante Cleveland. I am a former NFL player. I played for the Patriots, 49ers, and Chargers. And now I am in the midst of publishing my first book, and I work in digital advertising.
Very cool. Yeah. And I think that where I want to take it centers around the book. And these were some of the questions I didn't ask at coffee because I was like, I want to hear it for the first time. And then I want to touch a little bit because I did find this very interesting in terms of just your career in the NFL and some of the psychological aspects of being an elite athlete playing at the professional level, because I just think that it's good for sports fans to gain a little bit of awareness there around just how challenging it is for athletes. But
yeah,
I want to hear your story as it pertains to abuse and the journey that you went on to get to the place where you're at now.
Yeah. So growing up, I dealt with abuse. My parents were together until I was maybe like 5, and then they got divorced. And I would get like whoopings intermittently then when I talked out of turn or I was being a kid. And when they got divorced, it got worse when I was over at my mother's house. Okay. And so she was the person who was the main abuser. And it was, if I didn't show her the respect she felt she deserved, or if I didn't turn in homework, or just little things that I would get in trouble for. And one of the more unfair ones that I didn't know it was abnormal until I started sharing with some friends at school, what was going on at home, and to see their reaction, this isn't normal. But one of the times she asked me if I brought my math book home the night before, and I didn't, and I had a test the next day. So she was like, well, you better get 100% on that test. So I kind of understood the stakes in that moment. And so as the next day, as the teacher's passing out the tests, I'd look her dead in her eyes. I'm like, hey, I got to get 100% on this. And she was like, okay, yeah. I'm like, no, seriously,
you don't get it.
I got to get 100% on this test. And so I took the test. I was pretty confident in it. At that time, I was a good student. I was getting 3.8 GPA and above throughout the whole year. So it wasn't like I was a bad student.
You're a great student.
Yeah.
I mean, 3.8, I think the highest I ever got was a 3.75, and my parents were freaking out. They were like...
Well, this was 5th grade.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
This was in 5th
Fair
grade.
enough.
And so a couple days later when the test got graded, she came in and asked my teacher what I got. And my teacher was like, I know he said he wanted to get 100%, but he got a 95. He got one wrong. And it was like, oh, damn, I knew what that meant. So when we got home, I got a spanking, and it was just stuff like that. And that was, to me, felt just really unfair. And it all ended when I was 11, when I got a whooping for she thought I hung up on her. And she woke me up the next morning. Like normally when I would get in trouble, I would it's like right when we got home, I would get spanking. And she used a glue stick, which was like this like foot long, like maybe like 2 or 3 inch thick, like industrial glue stick, but like one of those things that would just bend but never break.
Yeah.
And so that the next morning, so I go to bed the night before thinking like, okay, I guess I'm good, because I knew she was upset. And the very next morning, she woke me up out of bed at like 6 a.m, drugged me to her room, and then I got a bad spanking and like left bruises, a lot of welts, but it was horrible. And that was the first time where after that, I like called my dad and like told him what happened. And then he showed up to school the next day. And then he told the principal told Child Protective Services. And from then on, after that, I lived with my dad for the rest of my life.
Yeah. So when you were getting these spankings, like, was it one solid smack, or were you getting beatings?
Yeah. So it would be for like the 100% one, I probably got like 8 or 9 swats. And then for the one where she thought I hung up on her, I had like, when I looked in the mirror, I had like over like 20 welts on me. Like,
yeah.
There was like, I had a bad bruise above my knee, or just below my knee. Like all over my backside. Like I would like roll over. So I had some marks on my arms from kind of just like covering up. And so, yeah, I was 11 years old.
Yeah. So there's like so many things running through my head. Cause number one, like I got spankings growing up too. And my parents and I, like, different from you though. That's why I wanted to ask that clarification. Cause my friends and I were just joking about this the other day. I was a troublemaker. It sounds like you were a really good kid. Yeah. And I was kind of a troublemaker. Like I know that I was, and I would get spankings, and they eventually stopped after a certain age. And obviously I know that that's like, it's not kosher to spank your kid like at all now. But I feel like back then it like was still kind of a thing. When you were getting, because it was beyond just a spanking. I feel like you're kind of downplaying. Like these were whoopings, like real straight up whoopings. Like, because for mine, it was like, okay, there's your spank, there's your lesson. Like, don't do that again.
No, it was more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's like a couple things that I want to ask. Like, was there this like kind of mounting anxiety that you would then have as a kid about making mistakes and stuff in front of and around your mom?
Yes. There was always the anxiety of like doing something that would get me in trouble. Like I kind of learned real early, kind of like reading people's moods. And like, I was very aware of like when her energy would shift. Because like outwardly, she was very like cheery, like jovial person. She was very high up in the church. She was a high school teacher, like well respected. And so I kind of knew the person that was beneath all that. And so I would just kind of have to like walk on eggshells often, because like I wasn't a bad kid. I wasn't getting in trouble for like talking back to teachers or anything crazy like that. It was like maybe I didn't turn in my homework or something like that. So
like normal kids stuff, like things that kids do. Yeah.
So like the real anxiety would build when I knew I was in trouble and we were like on the way home. Like we wouldn't say, like nothing would be said, like the radio's not on, and it's just tension of like, you know what's coming. There's nothing I can say that's going to get out of this situation. And it's just like, all right, well. Did
you try? Did you ever like plead with her? Like, please, like, I know I made a mistake.
Well, the time where I hung up on her. So what happened? Like it was a sports banquet. So I was in middle school, but there was a bus that would always take us back to the elementary school where she would then pick me up. And since there was a sports banquet, I figured since I'm gonna have to come back here anyway, I'll just stay here. I'll get to hang out with my friends a little longer. And she would just bring my stuff, my change of clothes to the banquet.
Yep.
I didn't communicate that to her. And so at the end of the day, I got a phone call, calling me to the front office, and she was on the line asking like why I wasn't at my elementary school. And I said, well, since we're going to be here, just come bring my clothes. And she wasn't all that happy about it. And I was like, all right, well, I felt like it sounded like she was finished saying what she was saying. I was like, all right, well, bye. Hung up. 5 minutes later, she calls back and not happy. I can feel the anger through other. She's like, did you just hang up on me? And then I had to kind of retreat to like the very submissive child of like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean like, yeah. And even after the banquet, like in front of everybody, like everything's fine. Once we get in the car, I try to like plead my case, like, hey, I'm sorry. Nothing matters.
Yeah.
At that point.
She's just seeing red at that point.
Yeah. But able to just kind of keep it under wraps because we were still like doing other things that night. We went to church. We went to my aunt and uncle's house. And even then, like I remember my aunt asked like, oh, he's awfully quiet tonight. And she was like, well, he knows he's in trouble.
So, how did her energy change? Like, would it just get really cold?
Yeah, it was more so just knowing. Yeah, it was like her energy would get colder. Like maybe to anybody else looking like nothing changed, but it's like I sensed that like, okay, there's something different.
You had a feeling.
Yeah.
The phrase that comes to mind to me is like hurt people, right? Like
for sure.
So the question then becomes for me, was there unresolved trauma with her, maybe in her upbringing, the way that she was raised? I mean, certainly, and obviously this has been at the forefront of this has been the discussion more than ever in the last few years. There's obviously like the racial component as well, I would have to assume.
Yeah.
So how do you think all of that played a factor?
Well, it's definitely the cycle of trauma that just continues to repeat itself. Like growing up, you would hear stories about, oh, my grandmother body slammed my aunt because she came home late, or my great aunt threw a fork at my uncle's knee and that's why he walks like that. It's like you hear stories like that, and it's just that cycle of trauma that never really gets healed, never gets addressed, and then just perpetuates throughout the generations. And I think, especially like at that time, no one really had the awareness to kind of really talk about how they were feeling, what they were going through. So it would just get buried. And it was almost just like a cultural thing. It was just, that's what happens within Black families. Like that's very common for a lot of dudes like grown up who like they've got a bunch of spankings, beatings, whatever you want to call it, from their parents. But it really goes back to, it's like generations and generations and generations ago. And like I just started reading this book, My Grandmother's Hands, and like that sort of punishment from the parents kind of originates from slavery.
Yes.
And it just continued, like slave master would whoop like the strong men, and the mothers would fear for their young child, so they would beat them so that the master wouldn't have to beat them. And that just kind of perpetuated until like we just created a cycle and culture of abuse that doesn't serve anyone. It creates people who have a lot of pain, and maybe they find a healthy way to deal with it. Maybe they don't. Right. And so it just, until we figure out a way to deal with our trauma and our pain in a healthy manner, it's just going to keep continuing. But yeah.
Well, so that explanation right there is the first time that I've heard that, and it makes so much sense to me that you can track it back to slavery, because it makes so much sense. Because of course the mother would rather take it into her own hands than put it in the hands of somebody who just looks at another person as property and could give two shits about how they feel. Especially, I mean, people were not talking about their emotions back then, let alone the time period that it was in. I mean, it's just wild to me, but it makes so much sense how that then becomes this ripple effect too, because like, so another thing in conversations that have come up with a lot of my friends of color is that it's this feeling that you have to be strong because nobody else is going to care about you. Nobody else is going to look out for you. So in a sense, it almost becomes like, I'm beating you to do you a favor. I'm making you strong. I'm preparing you for the world. Do you think that there was a component of that?
I'm sure in the rationale that it's somewhere in there. I'm sure it's in there. However, I don't think we've, as a culture, done a good job of looking back and seeing in what ways has this benefited? In what ways has this created a healthier person? Are there alternative ways to show someone how to behave better or handle situations better? And then also looking at how do familial relationships pan out after that? Because I know a couple of the friends who grew up getting abused and they have zero relationship with those family members, that family member. And it's no coincidence. It's like you see where the tension and the frustration and the anger would build from. And so I think there's definitely a healthier way to parent, to teach someone. But the cycle that has grown within this culture isn't healthy and isn't really sustainable.
So it's interesting, and I appreciate you sharing this, because a lot of people, I feel like, would attack somebody for actually saying that, because they would say it's victim shaming. And I understand that there's a component there where it's like, I mean, obviously as a white male, I understand that. And well, technically my family, like, I'm German, so my people weren't even over here during that. But I also understand that, like, Germans are still white. So when they came over here, like, that type of oppression of like, get the hell out of our country was a lot different, obviously. But what comes to mind for me when you bring this up, it, like, you're talking about kind of getting introspective and building that awareness, but the abuse component perpetuates the cycle and further divides the family. And yet time and again, studies find that when you have a cohesive, tight-knit family unit, that the cycle sort of spins in the opposite direction. So I appreciate you saying that, because I've even seen that on one side of my family, and just out of respect for privacy, because I'm a very open person, but some people in my family are a little more private. One side of the family, very loving household. I mean, every family has their issues, but loving, right? The other side, a very abusive male figure, verbally and physically. And the spinoff with those siblings, you can see how the trauma manifested in substance abuse, in depression and anxiety, in self-esteem, and some of those challenges. And Siri's talking to me. Okay, thanks, Siri. Glad you found that. It just makes so much sense. So the question for me then becomes, how did that impact you? And let me start there. How did it impact you?
I didn't really know the long-term effects until like pretty recently. So like once I started living with my dad, I didn't really think about that time anymore. I got more involved in sports. So sports became my outlet.
Yeah.
I started playing basketball. I was already playing like soccer. I started playing basketball.
Are you nice at soccer too?
That was my first sport. I was pretty good at soccer until it just was too much running for me.
I mean, dude, that's sick. What you said, you're like 6'4", right?
Yeah. Lefty. Yeah. I was a left forward. I got a leg.
Let's go. Let's go. Yeah, I can see. I mean, you got, for people who aren't watching the video and they're listening to the audio, I mean, the guy's, he's got a frame. It's
Yeah.
no surprise why he went on to play football. But yeah, so soccer, that's surprising.
Yeah. So yeah, that was my very first sport that I really like grasped. And so I got way more involved in football, and then I found success there, played at University of Miami, then the NFL. And once I retired, I started to, like, a lot of guys who retire, they go through depression. Like that loss of identity is like really, it's a huge shift for them, like loss of identity, loss of community, no structure. So I went through a depression going through that, but at the same time, it still kind of felt different. And so I started reading this book, The Body Keeps Score.
I have that book on this shelf back here.
Great book. And in there, it talked about how boys who are abused by their mothers are higher proclivity to be depressed, experience suicidal ideation, anxiety. And it started to then hit home, like, okay, maybe this is just deeper than I miss football or anything like that, or I don't know what to do with my life. It's like, maybe this is a little deeper than that.
Right.
And so I had to then just really start to unpack what I went through growing up, because for the most part, I didn't put too much thought into it after that. I knew it was like, I didn't even really consider that a part of my story until a friend of mine, I kind of shared a little bit about my childhood, and he was like, hey, that's like really a part of your story, right? And I hadn't even considered it.
Well, they're such formidable years.
Mm-hmm.
They're such formidable years. And you and your dad never really talked about it? Like, was it just like, yep, you're living with me now? And
well, we talked about it as much as I wanted to at that time. So like right when I started living with him, he put me in therapy, and I didn't really think I needed therapy. It was at like 3 p.m. on Tuesdays, and it's like, Dad, I'm missing basketball practice to come talk to this dude I don't want to talk to. So I didn't really want to do it anymore.
Yep.
And so, and it never really came up until like going in my senior year of high school. I had to go and testify in an administrative hearing because she was applying for an administrative job and had to state that she had a case of like child abuse on her file. And so I had to come and then like testify about what happened, about a situation that I literally hadn't thought about for like 6 years.
Yeah. What was that like? Was it traumatic to revisit that, or how?
Yeah, it was traumatic with one, having to relive it. Two, I hadn't seen or heard from her at any point since I stopped living with her. Like she never reached out, there was no contact. And then what was worse was like going to the hearing. I saw like family members on her side that I hadn't seen in years, and just like being on the stand, getting like cross-examined by her lawyer, seeing her there. And I see like my grandfather, aunt, uncle in the backyard, behind them. And it's like, these people are all against me right now. Like these people aren't here for me.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of furthered like that, like, oh, these people don't love me.
Well, I feel like I have to ask, because you brought this up with other friends. Has there been an opportunity to form a relationship with your mom since, or is that just, it's off the table?
I've reached out going into my my fourth year in the league. I had a knee injury, and I was on injured reserve, and that was the first time I felt compelled to like reach out to her and kind of get her side of the story. And so we went to dinner, and I quickly realized that she's not going to own up to anything. There's always going to be a justification. And from some of the questions, I sense like there's still a little anger there. And so since then, there wasn't a real effort to like connect with her. But once I started like really like doing the work and reflecting on my childhood, I sent her this long voice message, like 15-minute voice message, just saying like how I felt. And it was just, she responded basically like, okay. And it was just, it made me even more upset. So what I gathered from that was I had to release the expectation that she would be the person that I thought she should be. I had to release the expectation that she would apologize or show any sort of remorse. And that was freeing for me to just kind of let go, because I was carrying that for so long, even though I didn't realize it.
Definitely. And it's it must be so frustrating and disheartening to want somebody to be somebody that it's, and it might not even be that she can't be. It's just that the work, to your point, you've put in the work. And so there are so many human beings walking the face of this planet that are wounded. They're hurt. They've dealt with their own trauma, or well, no, they haven't dealt with their own trauma. They are living in their trauma. And it's almost like it's like the life raft, right? Like they're hanging on to their life raft, barely able to keep their heads above water. Not to, completely let your mom off the hook. I can only imagine. Again, it just gets back to the hurt people. And I've seen that with some of my other friends. So I can picture it, and you can't go there if you've never tried. And so one thing I'm curious about is like when you were reading The Body Keeps Score, how did you start to connect? Well, so you started connecting the dots by sharing your childhood and people being like, yo man, like that's not normal. Like that's not how like a mom like shows love, or like that's not how I was disciplined. What did you learn from how the body keeps score?
That was the biggest takeaway, was that there wasn't that it was like, oh, there's something wrong with me. It's like, okay, there was something that happened that I need to dive deeper into. I had just started going to therapy because like I realized that I needed help. Yeah. And so that's when I read that book around the same time. So it was more so just confirmation that I've dealt with some things in my past that I need to work through, and I need help working through it. And that book was like kind of another tool just of like confirmation that it's not just me.
And the catalyst to you wanting to start that work was your transition out of the league and essentially feeling all these different emotions, loss of identity. And that's sort of what pushed you to be like, okay, I need to do some examining.
Yeah. The depression was very palpable. The ideation came along with that as well. And it was a point where I had one of those thoughts that it was like, okay, I need to talk to somebody. I've let this go unchecked for a little too long, and I'm in a kind of a scary place.
So then, of course, I want to ask, because you and I talked about this when we were getting our smoothies and tea, which we're redefining masculinity. Okay, yep. We don't just need to meet for a beer or coffee, y'all. It can be a smoothie too. Yep. A little croissant, whatever you want it to be. You talked about just how, like, I've been telling friends about this conversation all this week, because it was like the rotating locker.
Oh yeah.
That is savage. Like there's just one locker in the locker room, and everybody just kind of knows it's there, and it's constantly it's like a revolving door. Like people are just cycling in and out, and I get it. Like when you get to that level, it's a business. But there's something sort of it just feels, I guess, can you share with people kind of what you told me?
Yeah, so this was my second year when I was in New England. And like starting off the year, I was on practice squad. And for those who don't know, there's probably like 10 guys on the practice squad.
Wait, did you meet Tom Brady? I didn't even ask you this at
Of course.
You met Tom? Yeah, well, Tom threw you the ball. I mean, you were. Did he hand you off the ball?
No, he didn't hand it off to me, but
well, because I know you did. you cycled through tight end and fullback, right? You kind of like, depending on what team you were on. So I didn't know if he handed you off. So he's thrown you the ball before. You've caught a pass from Tom Brady.
I caught a couple passes from Tom. Yeah,
that's cool, man.
Yeah, it was. It was when I got to New England, and we had like the practice squad. It's not set in stone that like once you sign the practice squad, you're going to be there all year. So there could be. What was unique about New England was if you were on their practice squad, it's because they thought that you could potentially play for them. There are some teams where guys could be on practice squad, and even if everyone in their position goes down, they're not bringing them up. They're going to bring someone else in. But in New England, it's like you're a viable option. So if a guy got there and he wasn't quite the player they expected him to be or the player they needed him to be, then they would get rid of him in a day, a week. There were guys that would, so like there was a locker that was 2 down from mine, that it was always just, there could be a guy there for a week, maybe 2 weeks if he was lucky, or it'd be a guy in and out in like 2 days. And it was just like that constant reminder of that this can be over in a flash. So just make sure I'm doing whatever I need to do to still be here.
Yeah. And that strain, that mental strain, was it exhausting? Did you notice it? I
noticed it because I was having to introduce myself all the time, but it wasn't so much a mental strain. It was just like you understood like this is part of the business, and as long as you're doing what you have to do, because I was kicking butt on practice squad. Like I was making plays. They felt comfortable enough with me that they ended up trading the number 4 tight end to the Saints, because they were like, if something happens, like you're going to be the next guy up. So I didn't feel that strain because I knew that I was doing what I needed to do.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Tying it into the sports with how many athletes do you think, how many guys do you think that you played with that they use sports as their escape from childhood abuse and trauma as a way to just kind of channel that pain and that energy?
I think a lot of guys, it's definitely an escape. It presents an opportunity to maybe get out of rough neighborhoods that they grew up in, maybe to escape from family members that they don't necessarily want to be around all the time. And if there is like built up anger, like especially football, it's just a great kind of release to be able to just like let out frustration and just fully like glean into that like primal energy. And sports, especially football, a lot of guys use it as a way to, it's a vehicle for a better life, but also it's like a way to kind of just process things and just let go of frustration, or maybe like you have to go back to a rough situation after this game. So shoot, dude, you're giving it all you got in that moment.
Definitely. I mean, I can picture it perfectly. So can you kind of highlight the dark period? So was the injury that you went through, was that sort of, was the injury, was it a career ending injury, or how did you, I guess, decide to transition out of the league? And then I want to know about sort of that the rush in of depression and suicidal ideation. I'm curious about that time period.
Yeah. So going into my 4th year, I tore my meniscus and I had it repaired instead of just taken out. So it was a longer recovery. And I spent that whole time, I was working out. I got really strong, and I was fully expecting to come back and be the best blocking tight end in the league. So that's what I was like fixated on. So when free agency came around, the first day of free agency, New England flew me out to like do interviews and possibly like I was expecting to re-sign there. So they did MRIs and like all the doctor's visits. And after the day, I went back to the hotel, and my agent called me saying that they just looked at the MRIs and it doesn't look like your knee's healed. So they're not going to sign you. And that was a possibility that I hadn't even considered, that I wasn't going to be signed. So it took maybe 3 or 4 months. Like, I went to other doctors. There were some other teams that mentioned that they'd be interested. So I kind of went back home and like worked out for a couple months. And when I felt I was ready and had my agent reach out, like none of the teams got back to us. And so I was already kind of struggling because I thought I wanted to do sports radio. And during that summer, I had an opportunity to like do NBC Sports, and I didn't like it because it was way too gossipy.
Really?
So now I'm thinking like, I thought I had it all figured out. And then I realized that I don't like the thing that I thought I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And then when like nobody got back, I just decided like, okay, I need to retire, because even if I do get on with another team, it's not going to bring me any closer to knowing what I want to do after football. So it was like, I spent a lot of time just kind of bumping into walls, like trying things that, like, I had a photo booth with me and a buddy, bought a photo booth and like hosted a party. And like, I realized I hated that. I tried to do some other things, and like each time I would try something and it would just waste a lot of time, and I would be right back kind of depressed because like I didn't like it.
Yeah.
And from then, like during that time, I had an opportunity to do a podcast where I was like sharing my story, and I liked it so much that I decided to just come back and help him get on guests. It's called the White Tiger Podcast. I'm a co-host of it. Nice. And that was something that like gave me something to do, but I was still looking for something that was going to like help me make money. And there were just a bunch of random things that just ultimately didn't work. And I ended up getting a job at this real estate company, and it was like the used car salesman of the real estate world, which was very anti my personality.
Yeah.
But when I got in, I was just like determined to make it work, even though it just wasn't working. Like I wasn't doing well and I was miserable.
Yeah.
Like it was to the point where I was having suicidal thoughts all day. It was like someone else booked a meeting and I hadn't had any meetings this week. Oh my gosh. Like someone else sold a house and so it would just grow and grow all day.
Yeah.
And I was miserable. But one of the benefits of that job was one of my coworkers, this dude from Chicago, he was so confident. And that's what I really struggled, was like confidence on the phones. Like it was a real struggle for me. And he would call the same person like 100, like not like no joke. He'd call the same person 9 times. They would block his number. He'd call from his Google Voice number. They would block that number. He'd ask you for your phone to call that same person. And it was just, his tenacity was so intriguing to me because it was something that I just saw where I was lacking. And one day he was saying how growing up, he would like kick a soccer ball down in their basement and he would like break this light. And I asked him, I was like, man, did your parents have you like whoop you for that? And he was like, oh no, I probably broke that light like 100 times. And it just floored me that like you broke a light that your parents, I'm assuming they told you not to do, and there was no repercussions for that. And I started to see like maybe there's a correlation between the confidence and the person he is now, based like the fearlessness he has, based off he didn't have to worry about any like abuse growing up. And that made me really look at my own situation. And that's when I started like writing.
I'm so glad that you tied it in and tied it back to what you experienced as a kid, because it makes so much sense. There was this insecurity in the household that kids need to like experiment and explore and fall down and scrape a knee and knock something over and try out a bunch of different things and sort of be fostered into that. They need discipline. I mean, look, I'll be the first one to tell you I needed some discipline. Now, granted, I will say the spankings, they didn't really work for me, but I don't know. I don't like being told what to do. I think I told you that at coffee. I've been fired from every job I've ever had. I'm not good at taking orders. But one thing that my parents did do is I feel like they sort of like when I got a whooping, it was I would have been like, yeah, I kind of deserve that spanking.
Mm.
Whereas for you, the context feels a lot different. You got a 95, like my parents would have been over the moon about a 95% on a math exam. They'd be like, hell yeah, we're going out to eat. Versus you, where there just wasn't an opportunity to be Asante, a full expression. And you were almost taught, okay, the more that I retreat in on myself, the more the safer it was, which then translated into every other aspect of your life. Gosh, now and then we've got like 4 minutes left before you have to jump.
I can do 10 more.
Okay. Because how did you find your voice? Because so when we've crossed paths multiple times. Every time I leave the interaction, I'm always like, he just seems like the salt of the earth, nicest guy. So I feel like that is a part of who you are. But how did you start to find your voice in I guess after that realization, like, okay, I mean, he must be so confident because with that story, which is so interesting how you connected the dots like that.
Yeah. In a way, I'm still finding it. It's been a process of just getting more and more comfortable expressing myself, because that was something that I noticed was I would really struggle expressing myself, especially like you see, like I'll put up videos like talking into the camera now. Yeah. There was a while, maybe like a year or two ago, where like that was like so like stressful to me, like just even thinking about it. And there'd be so many times where I would do one and then just delete it. And so like it's still a process for me. I'm getting more and more confident in it, but like finding my voice has been like my challenge. So me writing this was an effort, just like a big step towards like, okay, I want to share who I am. I want to share what I've been through. So let me tell the story the best way I can.
Yeah. And can you tell people what the title of your book is?
Book is called Working Through the Dark.
Working Through the Dark. And I've seen the cover. It's a great cover. And sort of the structure of the book is story. It's a story / reflection, sort of like a workbook almost, right?
Well, still, we talked about like
we're figuring that out.
we're figuring that out. But
we're in the process.
We for sure have the story figured out.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think no matter what, it's going to be helpful because people need to hear this. And how you're at such a young age, you don't have context of the world. I mean, your world is your household and then your commute to school, what you talk to about your friends, maybe a sleepover here and there, and then back to your house. Like that's your world. Mm. It's so small. How about intimacy and love? Has it been challenging to accept love?
One of the bigger things, and I think this is something that a lot of men deal with, it was just more difficult to like trust and like just share what I was like feeling. Just like expressing like how I felt was tough. And one of the things that kind of I just had this thought, I had this experience where I was around a bunch of people, and like one of the prompts was like, how have you been made to feel like you're a burden, and why is it not true? And for me, I felt like I was being a burden if I told people how I was really feeling. As I like dealing with, like I had some child abuse in the past, or I was going through depression, suicidal ideation. And so I just wouldn't say anything. Yeah. And what I took away from that was I needed to needed to like rest my head on some people sometimes. Like I needed to kind of like lay down some of the weight and trust that they loved me and were willing to listen to me and just hold space for me.
I see so much of myself in that, because sometimes I feel like I have to be the strong person. And lately, more and more, I have leaned into literally exactly what you just said, like laying some weight on somebody else, laying my head down, like sinking into that and trusting that me expressing some of that vulnerability isn't going to result in them like leaving me or not thinking that I'm strong enough.
Yeah. And it's like, you can carry the weight, but it is good to kind of like take a load off for a little bit. And that only helps you get stronger, because the more you talk about it, the lighter it is for you. So ultimately, like the more you are able to share what you're dealing with, what you're going through, you're carrying the same weight, but you're a whole lot stronger now. So it's not nearly as heavy.
Yes. And I noticed that with myself too, that being able to, there's something about just letting something build up inside of you that just amplifies the weight of it. And when you just open up and talk about it, it starts to lose its power over you. So I guess for me, the question becomes, because for people listening, what is your recommendation in terms of how do people begin to connect the dots? How do they start to notice that they've maybe, because I want to I think that why I do this podcast is like, I want to shed light so that there's awareness so that people can heal. As a mental health advocate, the more and more I learn about the brain and people and psychology, I walk around and I see so many hurt people. And that's why you see the nasty comments on Instagram and Twitter. It's such toxic places because I think people are hurt. So how do you begin to notice that you're harboring something, and then what are your suggestions for beginning to heal?
I think you'll have a bodily reaction to certain situations, certain people, and when you do, like, take notice of that, like try to figure out where is that coming from. For me, one of the things, like I reflect, and I always, like, as I write, I think back on like certain situations. How did this situation make me feel? Why did it make me feel like that? Is this feeling similar to another time I felt like that? To try to kind of like trace back to like, where is the root of this emotion, this insecurity, and to at least bring awareness to it so that I'm less reactive, because when that situation does come up and I have that emotion, I think back like, okay, this is just this showing up. I can now like process that and decide how I want to react, as opposed to not knowing where this emotion is coming from. You react off impulse, and you're not getting the desired outcome that you want from your reaction. And so I think there's a lot of that going around too, is people just reacting off their own pains and insecurities with no awareness to where it comes from. And at some point, a lot of people will just say like, oh, this is just the way I am. And it's not true. It's the way you had to be maybe at a certain point in your life. But now, if you're still like that, it's going to affect how you're able to build relationships, find success. So like, the faster you find the root cause, the faster you can kind of like free yourself from it.
I love that so much. There's the pup.
There he is.
That must have drew right through that bone. There we go. Give him another treat, right? That's all it takes.
Reward the bad behavior.
That's right. It's so true though. You're absolutely right. The awareness part, the introspection. He's like, I want to contribute. Let me get in on this conversation. It's true. And I like what you said about, well, this is just who I am. And it's like, well, not necessarily. Maybe this is who you had to be when you were in that traumatic experience, because there's like the retreat into yourself person, which is what you were, but there's a technical term for this. I don't know what it is, but then there are people that when they're in those hostile environments, they then become and embody that hostile behavior.
They lash out. Yeah.
And they lash out. So there's the people that retreat in, There's the people that sort of go numb, and then there are the people that lash out at others. Those are sort of the different modes, and it's like, and it almost that behavior becomes fused with your identity.
Yeah.
But it's not who you have to be.
No.
So what I guess, is there a question that somebody could ask themselves to begin that introspective process? Question you've asked yourself in the past, maybe?
Man, for me, it was like, does this behavior like serve me? Does me retreating into myself, does me like not opening up serve what I really want to do? Does that serve who I want to be? And if I like feed into just never speaking on Instagram or never like doing what I really want to do, but I'm still living in that fear or that experience, is this helping me become who I want to be? And I think it's more thinking of who you want to be in the future as opposed to who you've been in the past or who you've had to be in the past. Just kind of pair up that identity of like the ideal future self. Like, what does that person look like? How do they act? How do they interact with people? And if what you're doing doesn't align with that, then start to look to see how you can change your behavior.
I love that so much. Looking to the future, who do I want to be, not who I was. And then that future ideal self, and asking those questions. I've done that. I started doing that exercise back in like 2015, 16, and it's manifested into this today, which gave me the opportunity to talk to you, man. So I want to get you on your way. I want to be respectful of your time. We're going to have to do a part 2, part 3.
I'm down.
There's going to be so many more conversations because I just have a bajillion more. But where can people find you? How can they connect with you? That's question number 1.
Connect with me on Instagram. I am most active on Instagram, at Asante Cleveland. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter at Asante Cleveland. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And then what is one piece of advice that you would give someone who is listening to this interview and starting their journey?
Just do the best you can. It's not going to be perfect. You're still learning. So as long as you're doing the best you can in any given situation, you will learn from it, you'll grow from it, and then your best will get better. And you'll look back a year from now and say like, man, I'm a lot further along than when I started. Like 2 or 3 years ago, I couldn't imagine doing a podcast talking about trauma, but now here I am.
I love that, man. And your shirt says it too. Do your best. Do your best, y'all. Well, Asante, it's just been an absolute pleasure getting to know you, and thank you so much for coming on to the show. And we will be 100% be doing episodes in the future. So I appreciate you, man.
No problem. Zach, thank you so much for having me on.
Right on, man.